of all, thanks everybody for coming to our second Dean Career Conversation, or Career Conversations, plural, since this is our second one. I'm particularly excited about today's session because we're going to be talking about the results of a tool that I have now used with literally thousands of my students at several different universities, and also with hundreds and hundreds of my executive education and leadership development clients, literally all over the world. It's never failed to produce some great insights for the people who do the assessment, and then when we do the debrief. And the fact that it works across different cultures and different age groups and experiences, I think is testimony just how powerful it is. When I first took the tool about 15 years ago, it really opened my own eyes because it helped me to understand, why do I love certain parts of my role as a professor? Why do I tolerate certain parts? And why do I actively dislike certain parts? Now, one part that I really dislike has nothing to do with strengths. It's called grading. And I'm sure you don't necessarily like grades either, but it's a necessary evil for a lot of the teaching that we do to help reinforce the learning that we're trying to impart on our students. But I also learned about parts of even my career as a researcher, and why I like certain parts and did not like other parts. And if we have time, I'll talk about that as well. My wife also uses it. She's a marketing professor. She's also used it with thousands of her students and scores and scores of her own coaching clients and so forth. And she recently completed Gallops global level of certification. And so I'm going to be able to leverage some of the training she got over the course of a week, even in this session today. You should also know that this is something that the Gallup survey research company does. It's their assessment, it's their books. So I don't make a dime off of it, neither does Karen. So I hope that my wife, that is. So I hope you understand that that's even stronger testimony. Unlike our own books, nobody is going to give us any royalties for the books that we've handed out to you, or the assessments online that you've done. This is a parable, if you want to call it that, by Pastor Rick Warren, who wrote it about a little bit less than 8 years ago. I'll just read it out loud, and then maybe ask for some people to share if they have had similar experiences. Once upon a time, there were some animals that wanted to start a school for animals. They decided the courses would include running, climbing, and swimming, and flying. Then they decided that all of the animals should take all of the courses. That's where the problem started. The duck was better than his teacher at swimming, but he only made passing grades in flying and was very poor in running. So they made him drop swimming because he was doing so well, and stayed after school to practice running. This caused his web feet to be badly worn, and his grade dropped to average in swimming. But everybody felt less threatened and more comfortable with that, except the duck. The rabbit started at the top of the class in running, but because of so much makeup work in swimming, he caught pneumonia and had to drop out of school. The squirrel showed outstanding ability in climbing, but he was extremely frustrated in flying class because the teacher insisted that he start from the ground up rather than the treetop down. He developed Charlie horses from overextension, so he only got a C in climbing and a D in running. The eagle was the problem student from the very beginning, and was disciplined for being a nonconformist. For example, in climbing class, he beat all the others to the top of the tree, but he insisted on flying to get there. Finally, because he refused to participate in swimming, he was expelled as well. Now, has anybody ever felt that they've had similar kinds of experiences to this little story?
Oh yeah, I mean, I think the analogy to animals makes it a little funny, but if you think about like grade school, or, you know, just being a child, like everyone's expected to go through the same process and learn the same skills.
Well, I certainly felt that way, not just in school, whether it's high school or middle school. I certainly felt that in college. Now, I went to college, I'm old enough that we actually had to pass a swimming test. So everybody had to do that until they eliminated that. But there was a lot of different ways in which we conformed, whether it was the clothing we wore, the activities we were expected to do, and so forth. Anybody else want to tell their tale of woe from days past. Okay, well, I'm sure other people have felt this way as well. So strictly speaking, what you did with that 45-minute to an hour-long assessment was a talent assessment, which is simply a natural way of thinking, feeling, or behaving. And you may have questions about whether this is a personality test or like that. It's strictly not a personality test, so that your results aren't going to be stable for decades. They probably will stay stable for years. I'll talk more about that in a few minutes. But it is something that either through perhaps even some genetics, but certainly your background as an early child, and then through a lot of other experiences, it's just become a natural way of either looking at the world or how you feel about other people or how you act, especially in public, but even in private. It's just something that's become almost second nature. What turns it into a strength is spending a lot of time practicing those talents, literally by just doing them over and over again, and then enhancing those talents by skills that you acquire and education that you're getting. All of that then turns into something that is the ability to produce consistently near perfect performance. And I'll talk more about how we're going to define performance, but think of just excellence that's becoming natural as you spend more and more time developing it. One of the things I hear way too often in my consulting and executive education teaching is how many people describe their organization as having a silo mentality, meaning that there's a lot of functional or other kinds of barriers or boundaries that keep groups of people from working together. So Stanley McChrystal, who is the successful architect of the surge in both Iraq and Afghanistan, had to build what he called was a team of teams. And it wasn't just different branches of the military like the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines. He also had to work with representatives from the FBI, the CIA, the NSA, the State Department, you name it, to be able to figure out how to successfully prosecute those wars. And yet they had their own particular identity and allegiances to their own home units. And so he had to get each of these representatives or groups of people from each of these different entities to start to think of themselves not just as a team, but as a team of teams. So that when they went back to their own individual teams, they remembered what it was like to be part of a larger team. How does this relate to strengths? Well, I think similarly, once we learn how to appreciate other people's strengths and not view them as weaknesses, and also to be more accepting of our own weaknesses, I think it's much more likely we're going to want to collaborate with other people. So what are your strengths? I think it'd be helpful if a few of you were willing to share a concrete example or story. It could be illustrating one of your strengths or a combination of strengths. I'll talk a little bit about some of my strengths and how they manifested themselves even from an early age. So one of my strengths is input. That means that as a child or as a young person, I like to collect things. I collected rocks, stamps, coins, back when you could still find Indian head pennies and silver in your coins back in the 60s and 70s. Collected baseball cards. I collected a lot of different things. And then, of course, I cataloged them according to various different rules or coin albums or stamp albums, things like that. But as I got older, it manifested itself in terms of collecting information. So when you're an adult, to have input strength means you like to collect different kinds of information and file it, catalog it somehow. So in my case, I love to read widely, and it's not just business books. In fact, as I get older, I read fewer and fewer business books because I think I'm learning less and less from reading some of the same kind of material over and over again. I love to read biographies and histories, things about science and technology, the arts. I also like to watch a wide variety of TV and programs and movies, and also music. So I collect a lot of different kinds of information in the hopes that, first of all, I'm curious, but in the hopes that someday I'll be able to make use of that information either for myself or for the people in my network. So who would like to talk about how they may have used one or more of their strengths so far? And it could be a work role or non-work role. Jen?
Hi, everyone. I'm Jen. I am in the MSLOD program, which is a master's program, and I work full-time as and executive secretary on the Ann Arbor campus. So a couple of my strengths are positivity and connectedness. One of the things that I'm currently doing is arranging all of the faculty visits for faculty recruitment. And one of the things that I've really recognized is those specific strengths really help me on a daily basis as I'm working the puzzle, the Tetris of putting it together, all of these itineraries and dealing with the stresses of things coming and going, staying positive in the midst of it, and also really recognizing the personal touches that we can make with some of these visits that are all virtual versus the ones that are virtual as well as in person, and just really recognizing how important it is to stay as equal in all of those to make it a great experience for each person that comes. So that connectedness is a really big piece of making sure that it's impactful for the people who are coming.
That's great. Great examples. And also, we'll get to this in a few minutes, another great example of how you can combine a couple of strengths to deliver another strength or category of strengths of capability, because you talked about how those two strengths help you arrange things. So even if arranger is not one of your top 5, I don't know if it is or not, you're able to do a lot of arranging because of those two combination of those strengths. So great example. Nicole?
So one of my strengths that I've learned over the years is that I'm really good under like high stress type situations. So in my current job, I'm at the VA. I work at like a step down unit from the ICU. So I'm able to, I don't know, I have like an odd ability to remain completely calm in like high tension situations, like a full code, doing CPR and stuff like that on people. Or I flew medevacs when I was in the Coast Guard, so I was able to kind of calm some situations down when everybody else was kind of in a like full panic kind of a mode.
Wow. Great. I mean, not great, but great example anyway. So thank you. Not great that you have to deal with it. Anyone else want to share one of their examples? Now, it's too early in my career to do some cold calling, so please don't make me call anybody yet. Yes, Becky Sue. Is it Becky or Becky Sue?
Just Becky.
Okay.
So I didn't realize it when you said inputs, but yeah, input was one of mine as well. And I've always thought of myself as a very diverse person. I collect rocks, I garden, I love music. I have a bunch of different things that I'm interested in. It's not just one thing, but I think, you know, from your example, yes, that's a way of me gathering information, and probably combining that with my other theme of being a learner, that they probably dovetail together, I would think. And so I gathered all that information, and I do that in my current role. And then that's a lot of I see that's where some of my organization and my need to have all that knowledge before I make decisions comes in from both of those.
I could go off on a tangent how when I retook my strengths, learner popped up into my top 5, but then I would be demonstrating that I'm undiagnosed, unmedicated ADHD. So I'll go down that tangent yet. But us input people find it easier to do tangents because we know so many different, or we've read so many different things. And then if you've actually learned them, you know, not just file them away, then it's even easier. Okay, I'm already doing it. I'm going off on a tangent. All right, anybody else want to share their strengths before we move on? Well, there'll be plenty of opportunities later to contribute. Okay. So like I said, you know, one of my favorite things to do is to read widely, and biographies and histories are clearly probably my most favorite genres, along with science and so forth. And so I read several books about Winston Churchill, and he demonstrated a lot of his strengths, and he was very even charismatic as a leader. So his strengths were really of a level that very few people achieve in their lives, and allowed him to lead not only Great Britain, but help lead the successful prosecution of World War II. So at an early age, he manifested a lot of his strengths, but he also had some pretty strong weaknesses. And it wasn't just people who were members of parliament who called him out on his weaknesses. It was also his wife, probably his dog even. There are a lot of people who noted that Winston Churchill had significant weaknesses. And rather than denying those weaknesses or pretending that they didn't exist, he acknowledged them, and he simply said, you know, I've worked with a lot of great people in my life, and I've noted that a lot of their strengths go hand in hand with their weaknesses. And we'll talk more about that and why that's so important for being an effective leader. So knowing what your strengths are allows you to demonstrate a lot of different things that is my wife and I have found in our 30 years of research on leaders and companies who build trust need to do if they're going to be able to build trust. And one of them, in fact, let me say in our new edition of our book, we're adding a fourth one, which is empathy. So it's actually empathy, which allows you to understand other people's strengths because you can see them in your own life, or maybe you see some of their weaknesses because you have a better understanding of your own weaknesses now that you know your strengths. So that gives you empathy, which is so important to be able to build trust. People need to feel that you understand where they're coming from. It's also being authentic. Just knowing what your strengths are allows you to be more true to yourself and not pretend to be, some kind of leader, because there's no one best way of leading. And the most effective way of leading is one in which you're being authentic to your own strengths, your own weaknesses. Yes, taking into account the situation, but not trying to do something that you're just not either hardwired or soft-wired to do. Then it means being courageous, being able to stand up to the status quo. Well, if I know what I'm really good at, if I know my strengths, that's going to give me a lot more self-confidence to then challenge the status quo or whatever is going on currently so that I can make it a much better situation, a much better world. If I don't know what my strengths are, I'm probably going to be less likely to take risks, try something new, to venture out into the unknown. And finally, it means being humble, because courage without that humility often, if not always, turns into arrogance. But if you know what you're strong at, you should be knowing what you're weak at. And that weakness should not only give you humility, but help you to be also more empathic, to recognize that other people's weaknesses are just part of the game. It's not because they're deliberately choosing not to be more excellent. So in our new book, we're calling it the EACH model: empathy, authenticity, courage, and humility. And all four of those attributes allow you to step out more, excuse me, and to be able to build trust with other people, and to also trust them, because you have that self-confidence that allows you to take that risk of trusting others. All right, there's 4 different categories of strengths. It's not so important that you remember where each of your strengths is, at least for now, but to realize that not only are there 34 different kinds of strengths, but they represent 4 very different ways of contributing to a project, to a team, to an organization, to leading others, to accomplishing more on your own, and that these 4 categories are quite different, and I'll talk about them in a second. Another way of looking at it is to put it into a pie chart or a circle, and to recognize that not only these 4 categories are they quite different from one another, but they're almost in opposition to each other. So people who have a lot of relationship building strengths, that is that yellow upper left quadrant as I'm looking at it, are focused on developing relationships with individuals, groups, or teams, but it's much more of an interpersonal approach to accomplishing work, to getting things done, to being a leader. That's very different than influencing strengths. So if relationship building is about getting stuff accomplished with other people, influencing is about getting work and change efforts accomplished through other people. So you might want to think of that as delegating or assigning responsibilities to others. And if you have those kinds of influencing strengths, you'll be more effective as you try to get things accomplished. Also, influencing is a lot less time consuming typically. You're less concerned about whether people are fully committed or engaged or agree with you. It's more, we need to get this done. Here's how we're going to get it done. You need to do it. The other 2 strengths, executing and strategic thinking, are also quite different from one another. Executing, like relationship building, is much more focused on internal aspects of an organization, whether instead of people, it's the processes. So relationship building is internally focused on people. Executing is internally focused on processes or systems or metrics. A lot of the structure that, in other words, that's necessary for work to get accomplished in a collective like a team or an organization. And it's much more about getting things right and keeping things from going wrong, maintaining stability, eliminating mistakes and errors and so forth, as opposed to strategic thinking, which is also not really people focused. It's often individual in its orientation, but it's much more about the possibilities. It's willing to embrace ambiguity. It's not really trying to seek out certainty like executing strengths are, but really to seek out innovation, possibilities, creativity, and so forth. Anybody have questions so far? Because I'm going kind of quickly. Okay, I'll keep going. So as Jen talked about earlier, in combining a couple of her strengths to yield yet another capability that could be classified as the arranger strength. I've got 5 strengths, and you'll see that if you went backwards, that 4 of the strengths are in the influencing category, and 1 of them is in strategic thinking. Now, again, it's not a personality assessment, so it's not like these are my strengths for all time. If I could have taken advantage of the assessment had it been available, which it wasn't in college in the 80s when I went to college, I'm sure I had a lot of executing strengths because I was doing a lot of work on my own. This is before group work took over higher ed and everything's done in teams, it seems like. So I had a lot of econ problem sets I did. I wrote a lot of papers, of course, on my own. So I was really executing or getting things done oftentimes by myself. Certainly I was doing a lot of analytical work as an econ major. I was learning a lot. So I'm sure I had a fair number of strategic thinking strengths. But I also remember to have a good time once in a while in college. So I'm sure I had relationship building strengths as well. What I probably didn't have was any influencing strengths, because until I joined a student organization or two and then became a leader, I wasn't really getting my work done through other people. Once I did lead a student organization, then of course I had to develop some influencing strengths. Similarly, when I went and got my PhD and other things, I had a lot of strategic thinking, some executing strengths, not a lot of relationship building when you're working on a PhD. So I either retained those strengths or maybe some of them may have atrophied. But also I wasn't developing influencing strengths as a doctoral student. But over the course of my career, as I've, in addition to being a professor, started adding leadership roles like being an associate dean or being a vice president of a tech company. I left academia for a while to do that. And then now as dean, much more of my work, in fact, almost all of it, is getting done through other people. So I don't think I could have achieved where I am today in my career if I hadn't been over time building increasingly a bunch of influencing strengths. Nonetheless, with those 4 influencing strengths, I still want to think I'm a nice guy, right? I still have some ability to build relationships somewhere in my life. How is it possible then if I have almost exclusively influencing strengths? Well, one reason is part of it's an artifact of how Gallup classifies their strengths. So they classify communication and woo as influencing strengths. Now, the reason they do that is wooing is not just building some network based on friendships or common interests. It's a way to build a network that then can add value to everybody in that network. Not only helpful to me as a member of that network, but also to everybody else who's in my network. So in that sense, it's getting work done through other people. That's why it's an influencing strength. And communication is not just how I developed it probably as a kid, which was telling a lot of jokes and stories, because we did that a lot in our family and around the dinner table and so forth. But it's a way to communicate ideas in a way that then helps convince other people to either join the team and help us out, or actually give us resources when I'm talking to benefactors, funders for the School of Management now. I love telling the world about our great students and our research and our professors, our ideas and programs, and then telling those people who are in a position to help us, please give me your time, talent, and treasure so we can take that all to the next level. So those 2 strengths, which you normally might think, hey, that belongs in relationship building, they've chosen to classify as influencing strengths. But the way I still am effective as a relationship builder is by combining these strengths. So it's not typical for a professor to be an activator. It means I don't like to sit around and just do nothing but analysis. Sure, I love doing statistics and quantitative analysis, but I want to do something with it. So that's why I'm an activator. It's like, when do we get started? When do we actually start taking some action about what we've learned or what we know? So I'm out of my seat a lot. In fact, I've spent more time in my dean's office probably in the last 6 weeks than I typically spend in any office in my career. That's going to be changing over time, but I don't like to sit around in my office. I want to be out doing things, and also combining it with woo and communication. So if I know how to communicate with other people, If I like interacting with them with my woo strength, and if I'm not just sitting by myself in my office, combine those those three strengths should allow me to be able to be effective at relationship building. So as you progress in your career, you never really lose your strengths. They just move out of your top 5. And I do have at least one relationship building strength in my top 10. There's a way to get your full 34 strengths if you want. I can talk about that. But I'm using just more than that one relationship building strength that's in my top 10 to build relationships. I'm using some of these influencing strengths in combination. So this is a set of pie charts, which is just a distribution of all the different strengths that have occurred over the years in my various classes that I've taught. And regardless of whether they're face-to-face in-person classes or online, whether they're in the fall or the spring, not that that should make a huge difference in the student composition, the strengths are fairly consistent overall. That is, there's a lot of executing strengths, at least a quarter, sometimes 30% or more, a lot of relationship building strengths, a lot of strategic thinking, and then typically, with the exception of one year, less in the, or at least 2 years, less in the influencing strengths. Now, again, it's probably for all the reasons I outlined in terms of where I had my strengths in college. There are probably more blue strengths or influencing strengths in my student populations because they're business students, various different majors, but they're all focused on the bottom line in a lot of their coursework, and they recognize that a lot of that bottom line results come through influencing other people. So if I were to do this with a different group of students or a different group of people, I probably have a very different set of results, even for college students. And it's certainly the case that different professions would have a different makeup or composition, and so forth. In fact, when I did this with East Carolina, where I was before I came here, with their library staff, we did about 70 of their 90 librarians and librarian managers. You see a very kind of a different set of strengths than exists for a lot of other professions or even groups of college students. Well, clearly they're going to have a lot of strategic thinking strengths because librarians are in the business of both learning a lot and then helping to disseminate that learning to others, whether it's helping to find the right information resources or helping professors with their research in terms of gathering the right kinds of data or from different resources online and in physical resources around the world. They better have a bunch of relationship building strength because they're working with a lot of students and faculty. Some they're working with each other, but it's mostly helping other people to learn, and therefore they should have a lot of, relationship building. A lot of their work, though, is done in isolation or by themselves. They're spending a lot of time in front of, used to be books, then it became terminals. Now it's their laptops or even their mobile devices to, again, help students and faculty with their information needs. They're not really telling a lot of other people what to do, except for if you're old enough to remind you that your library book's overdue and you're going to have to pay a fine if you don't get it back on time. But librarians, for the most part, are not in the business of trying to get work done through other people. It's either with other people, that's why they have a relationship building, or work that they do on their own. This is the same result as that pie chart, but broken down by individual specific strengths. So you can see, not surprisingly, a lot of input strengths. So like me, they probably read from a very early age. They love to collect information, and they're still doing that now in their careers. Intellection, so they like learner. They like to acquire knowledge, often for its own sake, but also to be helpful to other people, and so forth. And so they have a lot of strengths, especially ones that are focused on the acquisition and sharing of knowledge. They also have empathy and relator, so other strengths that help them to understand what students and faculty might need when they're asking for help to get some information or to find a resource that they can't find on their own. And they do feel, a lot of responsibility, not just to the profession in library science, but also responsibility to the organizations that they're part of. And they also like achieving things, which is why a lot of them go on to pursue, master's degree in library science and other things. Not surprising, they're also highly consistent and deliberative, which means they put things in the right order, which is really important. If you are old like me and had to go find books in the stacks, if the books aren't filed where they belong according to the course catalog, you'll never find it again. So having deliberative and consistency and restorative, all those kinds of strengths are very helpful to a librarian. But if we generalize from this, we can say, if you were an organization and you're trying to get something accomplished, first of all, do you have all 4 categories of strengths available to you? If not, then that's one question that needs to be figured out, or issued or challenged to be figured out. But once you've figured out if you have all 4 categories of strengths, do you have enough of the kinds of individual strengths that you need to also get the project, the goal, whatever it is, accomplished? And it doesn't mean you have to have all 34 strengths or even equal numbers of those strengths, but do you have enough of those individual strengths in each of those 4 categories that you can meet the challenge, the goal, the task, and so forth? Now, if the answer is no, that you don't have, say, any influencing strengths, or you're missing, in this case, self-assurance or competition, those are some of the strengths these librarians were missing. If it's that critical to getting what you need to get accomplished done, that means you need to go and probably recruit people who have those strengths or have that category of strengths. Because the logic of strengths is that it takes a long time to develop this set of strengths, years, if not longer. And if it's not in somebody's top 5, certainly if it's not in their top 10 strengths, we just aren't going to be able to draw upon it or utilize it. If it isn't somebody's top 10, you probably can coach that person, but it's still going to take them probably months to develop. But it might take even longer than that. And so that's the reason you, instead of trying to just get to people to complement each other's strengths, you might have to go external to the team or the organization and find those missing strengths out there in the world. So I'm kind of talking a little bit about moving from your own individual strengths now to how the team comes together. So it's no surprise that, the best teams are highly diverse. The best organizations are highly diverse. Here's one more reason why that diversity really matters, and that is no one person can have all the requisite strengths himself or herself to be able to accomplish what needs to be done. And because it does take so long to turn them into strengths, otherwise they wouldn't be strengths. They would just be stuff you could buy off the shelf or get a book and quickly read up on it, and then you know how to do it. But because it does take such a long time, it really is a strength that then delivers really excellent performance. You've got to then find other people who can complement you. First, in a partnership kind of way, that's that second step. So who else do I know that I can share my strengths with to find out what their strengths are? Ideally to find out, hey, I really think I know I need to do this kind of an activity. It requires that category of strengths. I don't even have that category, or it really requires a great deal of empathy, and that's not in my top 5. Who do I know in my world that maybe has that empathy, who can, at least initially, substitute or help me because I'm missing it? And then over time, I can learn from that person through coaching or other informal interactions, so I can slowly develop that kind of empathy. So I've got to find that person I can trust and share those strengths with, because it also means I'm going to be sharing my weaknesses as well. And then as you move up a level of analysis or collective, then you're talking about a team. So if you're the leader of a team or the member of a team, it's your responsibility to make sure that all 4 categories of strengths are represented on that team. And if not, to find out, is that category at least resident in somebody's top 10? Okay, it's not even in their top 10, then we really need to go add people to our team over time who can fill in that missing category, that specific strength, because we really need it if we're going to be effective. And as the team gets to explore each other's strengths, as they build more trust with each other, admit their weaknesses, then you really can start to act not just as a collection of complementary strengths, but really, if you think about it, it's combining the strengths like I did for my individual 5 strengths so I could still have relationship building. Now as a team, we can combine our strengths, really meld them together in a way that's going to lead to capability that as a bunch of individuals we would never have. And so this is just one example. This is actually another group of students that I coached a couple years ago at a different university, not East Carolina. But I met some of these students through an on-campus visit, and they're actually all a bunch of engineers. So it's amazing that they have so much relationship building among their strengths. Not that I want to sound biased, but engineers typically aren't great at social interaction. To get this group is. Maybe that's why they reached out and said, hey, can you do this Strengths Finder workshop for me? So because almost all the members of this group of students also were leading a small kind of for-profit enterprise. It's actually a company that sold goat cheese because this university's mascot is a goat. Anyway, so they also learned this is not just helpful for us to get along better, but we now know why we put Zoe as our next CEO of the company, because she really had some critical strengths, especially in the influencing category, self-assurance and activator. She was also a field hockey player. We needed those combination of strengths if we were going to be more successful in the future. And it was actually handed it off from a very different leader, Jamil, who didn't have any influencing strengths. But at the beginning of their company, as they launched it, yes, having a lot of relationship building was really important. But as the company matured and grew in its revenue and number of employees and other things, then you needed to have those other kinds of strengths if it was going to continue to be led successfully. Now, some of you may be thinking, gosh, I only have like Aneil, 4 of my 5 strengths are in one category. I don't have strengths in all 4 different categories. Does that mean I'm not going to be an effective leader? Absolutely not. Again, there's no one best way to lead. Some of the most terrific leaders that Karen, my wife, and I have worked with have almost exclusively relationship building strengths, and yet they've been very effective in influencing other people. I could talk about it later if we have some time, but they used a combination of strengths that still yielded capability in a very different category of strengths. So rather than trying to be a little bit of everything, and if that is the case, if you do have 4 different strengths in your makeup, that's great. It'll make it easier for you to appreciate other strengths because all different categories. Rather than trying to be a little bit of everything, I think it's more effective to be who you really are, to recognize that over time you will grow and develop new strengths that'll move into your top 5, but to leverage those strengths that you've got already, even if they're all in one category or mostly in one category. Does that make sense to people? So don't try to be something you're not. By the same token, if people continually remind you that you really aren't good at something, because in this case, I'd say you're lacking that strength, then you need to work on it and bring that weakness up to some minimally competent level, not to the point where it's a strength, but so that it's not harmful or destructive or debilitating in your ability to work with other people, to lead other people. So for example, I'll just be honest and say that for whatever reason, I don't believe it, empathy is in my bottom 30s, like 32 to 33. Does that mean I'm incapable of understanding how other people feel? No, I don't think so. I do have relator, so that's a related kind of a strength. But as my wife would remind me, who does have empathy, either in her top 5, I think, or certainly in her top 10, that I'm maybe not as patient as she is when it comes to understanding all the things that our children are going through. Because as an influencing kind of a person, maybe because I'm the dad, I don't know, but I just want to solve the problem, get the result done, fix, the boo-boo or whatever my child's got bothering them, and probably spend less time listening to them. And that's not a strength, but it is one of my weaknesses. I'm demonstrating that today by talking way too much. So I've had to learn over the years with a wonderful coach, my wife of 36 years, who's going to spend the rest of her life rehabbing me to turn me into a better listener. So yes, I have to become minimally competent at listening to other people, knowing that I probably will never be a world-class empathic listener. Now, you have to be a world-class empathic listener or have some kind of equivalent for that if you're really going to lead people, especially lead them to try something they've never done before. You need to know where they're coming from. But I'll either use related strengths, or I will use my wife or other people who are very strong in empathy or in relationship building strengths to help me out, whether it's as a dean, as a parent, in a nonprofit role or something like that. Because I've always gotten in trouble for talking too much and never got in trouble for listening too much. So again, bring your weaknesses to some minimal level, but don't try to turn them into strengths. because in my case, it might be decades before I'm what my wife might call a competent empathic listener. Okay, so how do you start to build maybe that complementarity or to be able to leverage other people's strengths? Well, this is where Karen and I spend the bulk of our research and consulting time and our teaching. Once we learn some things in our research and consulting, we share that with our students and our clients. And that's by building what we call the rock of trust. So every effective leader we've ever worked with has found a way to develop what we call the rock of trust, 4 different kinds of trust with other people, with entire organizations. Even if they have a particular set of strengths that are very different than somebody else's. So regardless of their strengths, all the leaders that we've worked with who have done truly transformational kinds of accomplishments have been able to first be reliable, that is to be dependable, consistent in your actions and so forth. So some of you might have consistency as a strength. You know, building trust in terms of reliability is going to be easier if you've got consistency or related executing strengths. Then it's important to be able to be open and honest, which is really the opposite of being reliable. It's admitting what you don't know. It's not trying to show what you do know and being highly dependable and consistent. It's actually being willing to be perhaps somewhat inconsistent as you're trying to learn new things, as you're trying to both share what you know with people and also be willing to share what you don't know. So that openness and transparency is also critical for both a leader and an organization to be trustworthy. They've also got to be competent, because if you're liked a lot, but people don't really think you're going to be able to lead them out of this situation, they're not going to follow you. So you have to have that demonstrated competence as well, which comes from a wide variety of sources, including what you're doing now, that is learning and earning your degrees. And finally, it's to be compassionate or caring, concerned about others. At a minimum, it means that you're not going to take advantage of somebody else. You're not going to stab them in the back. You're not totally selfish. At its ultimate expression, it really means being altruistic or sacrificing for the benefit of the team or the whole. But in day-to-day, practical circumstances, at least it means I'm going to balance my self-interest with interest for your needs and concerns and so forth. So you put all 4 pieces together, we call it the rock of trust. Now, here's one example why it's so important to partner with somebody who's very different from you. So as I'm writing my dissertation up 30 years ago, and I've identified these 4 kinds of trust by studying General Motors executives and their suppliers and so forth. My wife, who's a sales and marketing executive at the time, she's reading my chapter. She goes, Aneil, do you know if you put these 4 types of trust in the order you've done, it spells crock? Now, how about if you reorder the chapters, you could call it the rock of trust? Yeah, okay, that's real. I didn't even think of that, right? Well, she's a marketing person. She's in the business of using words to convince other people. I still think I would have had a great career with Pottery Barn or with those mom and pop shops that glaze pottery. I think, crock would have worked really well with, but it'd been a very narrow kind of segment of the business world. So again, working with somebody who's very different from me in terms of her personality, in terms of her strengths, I think we've yielded a much better, not just a mnemonic device for remembering what trust is all about, but in our ability to communicate with other people. So if you have your strengths, if you're consistently demonstrating them, you're going to come off as more reliable. So again, you don't have to have a lot of executing strengths to be reliable. You just need to be consistent in how you display or demonstrate those strengths. Again, as I mentioned earlier, if you're willing to admit your weaknesses as well as saying what your strengths are, you're going to come off as much more open and honest because you're not pretending to be somebody that you're not. As you spend more and more time honing those strengths through practice and skill acquisition and more education, your competence is only going to grow, of course, over time. And then finally, if you do know what your own weaknesses are, you'll be more accepting of other people's weaknesses, and not saying that they're failures or stupid or incapable, but that they just have a very different set of strengths than the ones you have, and their weaknesses probably complement your strengths or are offset by your strengths. And in a similar fashion, your strengths can help to offset their weaknesses. Before I kind of wrap up, I want to go back to this example and see if anybody would like to think of one word that might sum up all of their strengths. Now, why do I want you to think about this as you're thinking maybe what that one word is? When I use this tool with my students and with my clients, but especially my students, I help them use their 5 strengths to rewrite their resume. So they put their strengths at the very top, not literally these words. So I don't put woo on the top of my resume. I'm not trying to date somebody else and they wouldn't understand what woo is. But I say I use my network to add value to the organizations I'm in, and I give a concrete example or something. So I put in what I call human speak, or different words, all of these 5 strengths at the top of my resume. It's also something I'm very quick to share with people, whether I'm applying for a job or I'm pitching a potential consulting client. And I say, here are the 5 ways that I can quickly add value as a consultant for you, or as a researcher or something like that. But sometimes people don't even have, time to listen to all your 5 strengths. So then I can say, I call myself an evangelist or a champion, which means I go and tell the world about all of our great people, products, services, and so forth, and then ask them for help to take that to the next level. There's another word there in parentheses called instigator. That just reflects the very seeds of your strengths can often be irritating or problematic to other people. So at home, I'm known as the instigator because, competitions is my #1 strength. I love to compete, argue, whatever. Activator kind of intensifies that. So I'm very well known at the family dinner table or holiday get-togethers for stirring up a hornet's nest. Everybody's getting along, and then I say to one of my children at the dinner table, well, how come you got that 1 A-? Really? Or something else. Because I get bored if everybody just, if it's going smoothly for too long. So over the years, I've been called a fire starter or instigator. And now our wives have all banned my brothers and I from playing games like Risk or other very competitive games because we're just so offensive in the way that we just compete with one another. So having spent all the time blabbering, does anybody have willing to share one of their one-word possibilities?
I don't really have an idea of what any of them could be because I joined a little late, but I like to think of myself as pretty dependable. Whenever, like, for example, right now, I'm living with my grandparents. Well, not even my grandparents. They're my girlfriend's grandparents. And I'm helping caretake for her grandpa. So, and, this was kind of like a thing where I kind of started coming in every day or every other day to help around. And then before I know it, this is kind of like my full-time thing. And, but that's just, that's just one example, but I feel like every week somebody's calling me to ask me for help with something. And so I guess at this point, I feel like that's the way that other people see it. And I think that's the way that I see myself as well at this point.
Good. That's a great example, Simon, for a lot of reasons. One, you're doing good things with that dependability or being a dependable person, especially for some vulnerable people like grandparents. But it also shows that you're able to apply your strengths, and especially true for young people, in a non-work role or a non-employed role. So a lot of people say, well, I don't have a full-time job, or I don't even have a part-time job, so I don't even know how I have all these strengths. When you do the assessment, well, you wouldn't have these strengths if you hadn't demonstrated them in some part of your life, either in a work role, in a family role, caretaking role like you're doing, or kind of almost extended family for you, Simon, or in a volunteer role or sports team or something like that. So they won't emerge as strengths until you've actually spent a fair amount of time using them, but it doesn't have to necessarily be in a work relationship. Anybody else want to share their one word?
Hi, my name's Marcia. What stood out for me when I was taking the questionnaire was completer. It talked about competition and winning in there quite a bit. And although I have done a good share of that in my life, I'm more consistent with completing in a dependable, timely manner. And I'm fine with that. And so that, I don't know, that's just what came up for me. I had two that were executing, two that were relationships, and then one that was a strategic thinker.
Okay. So just,
So,
you mind just kind of listing off the 5 strengths so I can hear them?
oh, responsibility, positivity, achiever, connectedness, and learner.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I could have come up with maybe other words, but I think completer really does sum that up. I mean, you've got responsibility. You probably have to be highly positive to see anything through to completion, especially things that are very challenging or, distasteful. Nobody wants to do that job, but I'll make sure it gets done. So I think that's a lot of completers could use maybe other strengths, but you found a really good way to combine your 5 strengths as a completer. And even if, you're not somebody who has competition or some other things that I love to complete things too. But my motivation is not as an achiever. I'm kind of delving into your individual strengths. My wife has achiever now. She redid hers for her new Gallops certification. And the difference between achievers and competition people is, achievers like to succeed for its own sake. They thrive on that ability to become better and better. Whereas people with competition, we love to be the best too, but we will exit an endeavor if we can never be one of the best, right? Which is why I don't play golf anymore, because I learned how to play golf on a 3-par course with used clubs back in the 70s, and I suck at golf. I'm never going to get good at it. My kids are, wonderful golfers, as is my wife. I will drive the golf cart rather than play golf with them, because for a lot of reasons, but one of it is competition is what motivates me. If I had achiever, maybe I would stick with golf for a lot longer so I could become perfectly mediocre. I'll never be good at it. Whereas my wife, at an early age, her dad, I think she was firstborn like I was, I think wanted a son for his first kid, and Karen's obviously not a boy. So he took her out every Saturday and hit golf balls. She tells me for 10 cents an hour. I still think that's slave wages. I don't know how anybody could be motivated to do something for 10 cents an hour, but from that, she learned how to hit and drive a golf ball really well. Well, that's because she's an achiever and not somebody who's competitive, which is also why she would not date me in high school, because we would go play tennis together and I would have terrific overhead smashes and I would just be so gleeful that I'd won a point, game, whatever, and then wonder why she didn't want to go out with me afterwards, because I was such a competitive jerk, which I'm slowly over the years learning how to be less of. Okay, anybody else want to throw a 1 word at us before I wrap things up?
I'll do one. Oh, someone raised their hand. Never mind.
Oh, go ahead. Yep.
Me?
Yep.
Most of my strengths are related with relationship building. So I would say communicative, because, I'm really good at communication. I mean, I might not always do it as fast.
Okay.
But,
yep. And what are your strengths, Taylor?
Put it on the screen. Restorative, developer, empathy, adaptability, and intellection. Did you hear that?
I'm sorry, I missed it. Go ahead.
Restorative, developer, empathy, adaptability, and intellection.
Oh, okay. And you say you're communicative. That's your 1 word, or yeah. That's an interesting combination of strengths, because restorative, how do you think you use that as a communicator then?
Well, I always because I've taken this several times, and I've noticed, I took it when I first started college, and then I have my associates now. So it's kind of weird to see how they change, but they're still the same top 5. It's just in a different order. Okay. So I guess I would say the empathy that I have, it's still pretty high up there. So I would say I use the empathy that I have to understand how I can best approach how to solve situations and problems. Okay. And use that together.
Okay. And how do you use restorative in terms of communicating?
I'm approaching problems. I you know, try to see what, like, I understand people and their strengths, and I use that to help me solve whatever problem I have.
Great. Okay, good. I use restorative. I don't think it might be in my top 15 or 20. It's not even in my top 10, but I do like fixing things, solving problems, putting things back in order, especially when they're not working. So, not all these strengths, determine your behavior in every situation, obviously. But the way I use restorative as a strength when it comes to communicating is I'm really good at apologizing. So I make mistakes. Sometimes I, offend people. Well, usually it's family and friends for the most part, because I am, so out there in terms of saying things, whatever's on my mind and so forth. So restorative is about resolving or fixing things. So people can use it as a way to communicate by apologizing or getting other people to come together. That's probably where your empathy and other strengths are coming to the fore as well, to get them to understand each other better as well. Okay, great. All right, let's go on then to kind of wrapping it up. So I want to always leave my audiences, whatever kind of group I'm working with a plan of action. Now, again, that's probably showing my bias or preference for activator as one of my top 5 strengths. Like, that's great, we learned all this stuff, but what are we going to do with it? And so I always tell people at the end of a session or a program, so what are the 3 things you're going to do differently as a result of what you've learned with me, whether it's been a day or a week or a whole semester? So, how are you going to, in this case, for the rest of the week and, in the weeks to come, how are you going to act differently or do things differently based on what you've learned today? Specifically, who or what types of people do you need to start first identifying to learn what their strengths are, and then to actually start to partner with them so that you can complement your own strengths. In other words, make your own strengths more effective, but to offset your weaknesses so they don't impair or interfere with your effectiveness, either as an individual contributor or as a leader of a team or an organization. You don't necessarily have to go and say, hey, in fact, I don't recommend this. Hey, what are your top 5 strengths to some person because they may have never heard of, StrengthsFinder. But as I call it, you can use human speak and just say, hey, what are you really good at, or what do you love to do, or why do you love to do the things that you're doing, or even compliment somebody and say, you're such a good team organizer, or you're such a fabulous chef, or whatever the heck it is, and say, why do you love to do this and why are you so good at it? And in listening to them, you will slowly but surely identify, what their strengths probably are. And then maybe at the appropriate moment say, hey, would you consider doing a StrengthsFinder assessment so we could learn more about each other? To me, one of the things, especially as someone with WOO, is one of my top 5 strengths. I've always been disappointed that I don't have a ton more people in my network whom I can call upon, partner with. I may have 1,800 plus LinkedIn connections, but it's still a handful of people that I can call upon for help, for guidance, for some individual coaching. And it took me years and years to realize that one of the reasons the number is so much smaller than I would like it to be is that if I'm going to ask for those people's help, especially, substantial kinds of help or guidance, I need to be able to do the same for them. And I'm only human, and there's only so many people that at some certain really deep level I can help out. Doesn't mean that's the same number for years, but it's going to be a different group of people, because it's always going to be 5 or 10 or maybe 15 or 20 whom I can really put the time in a way that I would like them to do for me. So that norm of reciprocity, to reciprocate or to pay back what somebody's given you, it's limited by your own energy and time and other kinds of responsibilities. So that's why it's so important for me to identify the right people over time, because there's only so many of them that can help and who can help me. I think the best way that you can convince people to be able to help you and complement your strengths, offset your weaknesses, is to find ways to build a rock of trust with them. And in some ways, I'd recommend flipping the rock of trust on its head and start out with compassion or caring or concern for others for a lot of different reasons, which I won't have time to go into detail today, but partly because I think there's just so little compassion or caring out there right now. There's many different reasons for that, but one of them is just how competitive our world's become, the global competition, which means people just don't have the time or the ability to spend time with other people like they used to. And it does take a lot of time. Being compassionate or demonstrating trust in terms of compassion takes the longest amount of time of all 4 types of the rock of trust. But we've learned in our research, which we're still doing, that it perhaps is going to become the most powerful way that you can differentiate yourself as an individual, but also as a company, how it can differentiate itself. Those leaders or people who are able to demonstrate that compassion as an individual, first of all, are going to get people to reciprocate, and they're sharing their own scarce time and energy because you've done the same for them. You've helped them first. And secondly, because at a group level or at an organizational level, people who trust each other in terms of that compassion or caring or concern, if they all feel like together we all want to help one another, then we're going to pool our scarce resources and time and energy and money. And that pooling of those scarce resources is absolutely critical for an organization to be innovative and to be effective for the long haul. So both individually, if you're compassionate, and as a group, if you can be compassionate towards one another, you'll deliver the kind of results that very few leaders or companies are able to deliver today. And I think it's getting harder and harder. Already talked about, maybe reaching out to people. I think it's also worth just reflecting on your strengths from time to time. I wish I'd done this early in my life. I'm still not doing it. I got to get to it someday, but I'm running out of time. And that is, keeping a journal. And in this case, a journal is really daunting. Who wants to write a page or 2 every day? It takes a lot of discipline. Discipline is not one of my top 5 or even 10 strengths, but I can certainly, write down a couple things. Here's how I use 1 or more of my strengths today. And over time, you'll learn maybe some patterns, either in whether you're using all 5 of your strengths or you're relying on a subset all too much. And then maybe that means I need to try one of those 4th or 5th strengths I'm not using as much, see what happens with it. But you can also see how are you building those set of strengths to make them even stronger. Okay. Again, like I said, share your strengths with other people. Talked about how to use it as a team. When I tell other organizations and companies how to use their strengths, try to find a way to be smart about it. So make sure that you're using your specific strengths in specific ways. Don't just say, tomorrow I'm going to go and be a successful, writer. Well, start with something much more specific. Make sure you can measure it so you know if you're actually getting any progress or not. Can you actually take some action on it? And so forth. I'm not going to go through all the details about SMART goals, but I think it's also important to reward yourself as you apply your strengths, as you are more successful using them, because you're going to inevitably stumble and make some mistakes, and it's going to hurt or not feel so good when you try something, you stumble. To then when you do succeed, to pat yourself on the back, pat your backs of your teammates, because that kind of reinforcement or rewarding one another for helping one another is what I think helps teams and organizations achieve the lasting results that they can do. Any last questions? Well, listen, thanks so much for participating in this month's career conversation. I would be remiss as somebody with WU for not recommending that you connect with me on LinkedIn. If you have a LinkedIn profile, please connect with me so I can help you and help my network help you as well in your career. And if you don't have a LinkedIn profile, we'll be talking about that as a future career conversation. But thanks again. Appreciate it.
Thank you for having us.
Much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Do you have a minute, or do you have something scheduled after this?
I think I might have. Yeah, let me just double check. As a dean, I've always got to check my calendar.
It's the marketing meeting.
Oh, it's just
It's just with me and Audrey.
I can put those people on. Once again, I'm showing no, this is just weaknesses. It's not even a strength. It's my selfishness. Whatever you need, I'm happy to help you. Yes.
So there have been a few things in the works, especially with the organization that I work with and trying to get events to happen. But two of the things that we really want to do, and this is a little bit newer of a focus on more